Hello, everyone. Today, we have Dr. Marija Popović as an invited speaker at the Tartan planning series. She will talk about robot learning and informative path planning today. Dr. Marija Popović is a junior research group leader at the University of Bonn, Germany, and the Cluster of Excellence at Rome. Previously, she received her PhD from Autonomous Systems Lab at ETH Zurich, Switzerland, and did her postdoctoral research at the Smart Robotics Lab at Imperial College London. Her research centers around developing algorithms that enable intelligent robot decision-making, including informative path planning, environmental mapping, and computer vision. Let's welcome Dr. Marija Popović, and let's let's pass the floor. I will pass the floor for her to start the talk. Thank you. Marija?
Great, thank you for the introduction and welcome to my talk. It's a really huge honor to be here today to talk to you about robot learning and informative path planning. I hope the topics will be interesting for everybody and we will have some insightful and interactive discussions in the end. Now, before I start my talk, I would just like to spend a moment to give acknowledgements to the 3 PhD students in my junior research group at the University of Bonn, Liran, Julius, and Jonas. They're at the bottom and also attending the talk, who contributed with their works to this presentation. So let's start with some motivation about the topics for today. We're going to discuss using robots for sensing. And why would we want to do that? Where here we see examples of different scenarios where tasks are done manually with humans directly in the loop. In these applications and many more, robots can make the tasks simpler, faster, and more effective to save us time, money, and labor. However, as we know as roboticists, making robots work in the real world is very challenging. In these examples, the robots need to reason about their surroundings, make decisions about what to do next, and plan paths in order to complete their mission successfully. And they need to do this while operating in environments that can be uncertain, complex, or dynamic. In today's talk, I'll be discussing how we can deal with these difficulties by integrating new learning-based methods and robotic informative path planning algorithms. So, to understand the problem that we're tackling, let's start with a simple example of using a robot for monitoring. Consider this UAV, which is shown here in a top-down view that has to survey a field. How do we plan paths for this robot? Following a conventional approach, we create a lawnmower path, as we see here, to cover the field at a fixed altitude, given the limited battery life. This strategy is quite simple, fast, and available in most commercial products today. However, what if there are certain regions on the field that need to be inspected more closely? For example, we're doing some kind of computer vision image processing operations on the images collected to identify crops and weeds, and we want to focus on certain plants, or we want to identify plant diseases or anomalies in the environment and collect more measurements there. Well, the major drawback of using a passive coverage-based approach is that the entire environment is mapped with a constant resolution limited by this pre-planned trajectory. Because we don't know the distribution of interesting regions in advance, we can't improve mapping accuracy in these areas and instead waste energy on exhaustive mapping. Through an active informative path planning approach, the aim is to perform more efficient targeting monitoring by allowing the robot where to go next. In this way, we can adaptively focus on collecting more higher quality data in these areas of interest, leading to a much better use of the limited battery life and a more efficient mission performance. However, developing such a decision-making strategy presents several technical challenges that we're going to discuss today. So first, we need to decide how will we model our environment, in this case, the field, and how can we define mathematically an objective to quantify the utility or the usefulness of potential measurements in the future. Second, we need to develop a planning algorithm that has to balance between exploring an unknown environment and exploiting these regions of interest as they are discovered, all the while generating paths that satisfy the robot's dynamic and endurance constraints. Also, if we want to replan from time to time during the mission and allow for adjusting the decisions based on incoming data, we need to make sure that our algorithm is computationally fast enough to be run on board and online, very resource-constrained platforms such as this UAV. And finally, an important part of both the mapping and planning processes is to have a reliable model of the robot sensor. Effectively, we use this model to update the map with new measurements as they are received, and also to predict how useful measurements are in the future when deciding where to go next using our informed planning strategy. Now, there's an example of a sensor model in this scenario. In aerial imaging, a key trade-off lies in the fact that real sensor data is noisy and at variable resolutions, as we know from images. So when mapping a field, the camera can see the same point from different altitudes, and we need to develop a sensor model that accounts for the fact that when the UAV altitude increases and coverage increases, resolution actually degrades. So we have less detail in our images. This makes the decision-making problem complex and computationally challenging to solve. In today's talk, we will bring together these three key elements as the foundation for active planning and robot autonomy. We'll discuss how to develop frameworks to address the challenges of active decision-making in uncertain 3D environments on computationally limited systems. And we want to place a particular focus on modern emerging learning-based methods and how can we incorporate them in our framework. We hope that this approach will allow us to push the boundaries of autonomous mission and robotic operation. So let's try to arrange these different elements to build the structure of an autonomous system. So starting with the input, we assume that our robot is equipped with a sensor, for example, a depth camera, a multispectral camera, from which measurements are extracted and processed. These measurements are used to construct a map of the environment of interest, such as the field we saw before. Here, we might also have prior information from previously executed missions that we want to add to our map. Otherwise, we can just assume an unknown environment and a pure exploration case. During a mission, we have a planning unit that uses the environmental maps built online to optimize trajectories based on a given objective, for example, efficient data collection. And this planner effectively closes the loop between action, decision-making, and perception via the map, capturing the current state of the environment. Now, a key ingredient here, which we come back to later, is the so-called utility function. This is a mathematical formulation which is used to reflect the aim of the mission, what we want the robot to do or to sense. An utility function can look like focusing on mapping weeds on a field more carefully or those diseases that we saw. We use this utility function to measure how valuable future actions are. Now, what is the current state of the art for building informative path planning frameworks? So for each of these components, most traditional and current decision-making frameworks rely purely on models. So let's look at some examples. For mapping, typically we have a model or representation of an environment. There we can see a familiar octomap, which captures spatial occupancy and cluttered environments. Another model can be used to calculate utility, for example, that of the sensor, and to evaluate the impact of future actions. So there we see a projective camera field of view, which we can cast into the environment to see what future measurements will be when calculating the value of future actions. And for model-based planning, we can use a sampling-based strategy. So we sample new configurations in the environment based on the current state, and we evaluate them according to a cost function, such as the distance to a goal or an exploration objective. And then we pick the best path from the sampling-based output. However, these approaches are inherently limited by the quality of the models and cannot be easily transferred to new environments. So to address these issues, in today's talk, we'll discuss how to integrate model-based planning with experience-based learning to address some of the drawbacks of current approaches. Leveraging learning components for planning in our active informative path planning framework offers several advantages. First, we hope that it can reduce dependency on prior knowledge. It could increase the algorithm robustness to disturbances and variability. A third point is that it can enable adaptation to unseen environments with unknown environmental condition and possibly even unmodeled objects. And finally, we hope that it can improve computational efficiency for real-time applications. Now, the realm of robot learning is very broad, and specifically, we're going to narrow it down today and talk about three key recently emerging areas of learning: reinforcement learning, active learning, and neural representations, and some of the work that we have done in applying them for robotics applications, specifically informative path planning. Now, just to make it clear, we don't want to replace model-based strategies in our framework. In fact, we'll see several valuable usages of models in the examples later, but rather we will want to exploit models for learning and more efficient online planning and adaptation. So that is where we're going. So let's go into a more technical formulation. So going back to our initial UAV terrain monitoring example, we're going to focus on what is formally known as the informative path planning problem. So given this robot flying over a field, how can we plan paths for it to maximize the information gain in the newly collected measurements during a mission, given its budget constraint? In simpler terms, how should this UAV fly to collect the most useful measurements given the limited operation time? Now, here we see this information measure I, a function appearing, which is essentially the utility function, which we previously saw in our framework overview. And this captures the aim of the mission. For example, as we see in the schematic, inspecting plants on the field more closely. Now, this informative path planning problem is generally challenging for three main reasons. First, we need to predict the value of future actions without the robot actually executing them. Second, to decide which one is best, we need to evaluate many actions in a high-dimensional problem space, which can be computationally expensive. Finally, our goal is to develop efficient online planning algorithms for resource-constrained platforms. Now, let's look at how those elements of learning can be exploited to tackle these difficulties. So the first line of research we will talk about is reinforcement learning, or RL. I will present a method of using reinforcement learning for predictive planning in the informative path planning step to increase computational efficiency. So the main idea is as follows. We use a neural network shown on the left to learn the best policies for gathering new data during a mission. We train the neural network offline in a learning phase using a realistic simulation environment, which we see on the right for the UAV-based terrain monitoring scenario. And so essentially, we simulate many diverse terrain monitoring missions in this environment with different terrain distributions and use a tree search technique to guide the neural network to figure out where the best policies or the robot actions. So we learn to predict where the measurements with the highest information content are likely to be found. And the reason we want to do this is that when deciding in the deployment phase where the robot should take the next measurements, we don't need to forward simulate many possible future actions using purely model-based planning. Instead, we only need a single forward pass to the already trained network. So here's some evaluation results of this approach in simulation against different benchmarks. So we compared it against the CMAES, which is an evolutionary optimization strategy, Monte Carlo tree search, coverage-based planning, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, and random motion. On the left, we can see how map uncertainty reduces over the mission time using each of the different planning strategies. And on the right, we see a runtime comparison of the different online methods. So looking at the results, we see that the RL-based approach reduces map uncertainty quickest, but more importantly, leads to significant speedups for online replanning. This validates that using our network trained offline, we save valuable time by just performing the forward pass through the network during deployment to generate the next plan, as opposed to performing this computationally expensive search over the action space above the terrain. Now, we can also see how this approach behaves in a more real-world scenario. So we collected some thermal data from a real agricultural field using a UAV. On the left, we can see an overview of the setup with the UAV with the thermal camera. And on the right is the thermal orthomosaic from this field. Now, given this real environment, we defined a planning objective where the goal is to map the high temperature areas in detail as quickly as possible. So there in the orthomosaic, the redder areas suggest higher temperature. And so in this setup, we compared the RL-based strategy against commonly used coverage-based planning in terms of map uncertainty reduction over time. And we see significantly faster uncertainty reduction in the targeted areas of interest. And this is because the RL-based strategy can achieve online decision-making and map these areas of interest once it has explored the field. There is a qualitative result to validate this. So once we can see an example path obtained using the RL-based strategy. So once it has explored the field and discovered the redder high temperature side, the UAV stays there to collect more measurements and map in detail as we would expect. So summarizing, these results show how using a neural network can be used to learn useful data gathering actions in informative path planning. Now, motivated by these results, I would also like to share an approach for using deep reinforcement learning for multi-UAV applications in a similar problem setup of UAV terrain monitoring. So considering several UAVs or agents, we need to decide not only where to measure next, but how to achieve efficient cooperation among the agents, given potential communication constraints among them. So as in the single agent case, the main idea here is to use a neural network trained offline in simulation and deploy the already learned parameters during a mission to achieve efficient replanning. The key difference is that here, as we will see, we explored a purely model-free approach, which even more tightly couples the learning and planning phases for this problem. So I will briefly introduce the approach. So this work is based on a state-of-the-art multi-agent actor-critic reinforcement learning algorithm called counterfactual multi-agent policy gradients, or COMA. Now, this figure overviews how we essentially adapted COMA to work in the multi-UAV terrain monitoring application. So as we see on the left, during deployment, we consider a decentralized setup where each agent selects its own action or where to measure next, considering the agents are in the same environment, of course, based on a local map. This local map contains information about all the history of all the measurements the agent has collected so far, as well as those measurements communicated to it by the other agents. And the next action, or the policy, similar to before, is obtained by a single forward pass through a trained actor network, which we can see in green. So how do we train the actor networks? So following COMA, this state-of-the-art approach, we use a centralized critic, shown in the purplish color. This critic is used before the mission during the learning phase based on a global map of the environment, capturing information about all of the agent's measurements. Now, this setup using decentralized actors during deployment and the centralized critic allows us to use what we call counterfactual baselines during training, and that's where the name COMA comes from. A counterfactual baseline is important because it allows us to measure the impact of a single agent's action with respect to the overall mission objective, thus tackling the issue of credit assignment. So we learn to assign more credit or more value to actions, to individual actions of the agents that contribute more to the mission goal and nudge learning in the correct direction individually. So far, the interesting point is that this credit assignment problem was tackled in classical reinforcement learning scenarios. For example, the original COMA was actually developed for a StarCraft game, but we are especially interested in applying such learning-based methods to robotics and informative path planning. So as before, the approach was evaluated in simulation against different benchmarks to assess the benefit of using the COMA-based approach. So we compared against different baselines, the random motion and the coverage planning strategy, as well as an information-based strategy, which uses models to evaluate candidate future actions based on a random walk approach. So we measure how map uncertainty on the left and F1 score on the right reduce over the mission. So these results show, looking at the green, that comma does indeed allow for improved coordination and faster uncertainty reduction when compared against the baselines, which motivates the use of a learning-based strategy for this problem. Now, if you're interested more in the reinforcement learning part of this work, the paper cited there on the bottom also provides a comparison against different learning-based approaches and demonstrates the advantages of explicitly tackling this credit assignment problem. So far, we discussed reinforcement learning and how we can learn the next best data gathering actions in informative path planning problems. Next, we move to the second topic for today, which is active learning. We will see how we can actively learn about a new environment to improve robotic vision using informative path planning. And here we focus on a slightly different application, which is aerial semantic segmentation. We know that semantic segmentation is a key tool for Earth mapping and observation. However, training supervised deep learning models for semantic segmentation depends on large amounts of high-quality human-labeled data, which can be very expensive and tedious to obtain. So there are some examples of semantic segmentation labels in an urban mapping scenario, and one can imagine that labeling these fine contours and details, for example, identifying the buildings, roads, and cars in the scenario, would require significant human effort. So to address this, hoping to alleviate human effort, we propose a new approach for using autonomous robots to collect useful data for network training. So let's see how our different mapping and planning components fit in here. So we start with a pre-trained semantic segmentation network deployed on a UAV. During a mission, the network predicts semantic labels and water uncertainties in RGB images the UAV collects. We then, given the UAV pose, project these images onto a global map of the environment, which captures these variables, as seen in the example. So based on the model uncertainty, which the network provides us, we plan paths for the UAV to collect the most informative data for improving network performance. And here, the key idea is to leverage ideas from active learning. So we want to pick the images the network is most uncertain about, reasoning that these represent the most difficult examples from the network and thus hold the most information value when added to the existing training set. So we essentially couple this utility function from informative path planning with an active learning objective based on the model uncertainty. The most uncertain collected images during the mission are then passed to a human annotator which only labels them. And our motivation is that by collecting new images in this intelligent way using informative path planning, we can reduce the total human labeling effort required as opposed to exhaustively labeling all images of the terrain. Now, this is a general framework that interweaves robotic informative path planning and active learning. However, notice it has different components which pose open questions. How do we implement the planning algorithm and the mapping strategy? How do we measure the active learning objective or the acquisition function? And how do these elements influence active learning performance? In a recent project, we proposed different strategies for each of these components and evaluated their impact on active learning performance in a robotics context. And I would like to share some key results about this on the next slides. So the main data set used here is this ISPRS Potsdam dataset for urban mapping. So in the evaluation, we compare how many images need to be labeled on the x-axis to achieve a high model performance on the y-axis. And here, steeper curves towards the top left indicate better performance because less images need to be labeled to get better semantic segmentation. Here we compare different informative planning strategies against lawnmower in yellow, which is the coverage-based approach that just executes a zigzag pattern through the environment. And we can see that the informative planners proposed either outperform or perform on par with the lawnmower baseline here. Interestingly, we can observe that global map-based planning outperforms a local planning scheme, which is this image approach, which essentially determines the next best UAV action in the local vicinity only based on the current image without relying on a global map of the environment. Now, in the same setup, we did an interesting experiment varying the mapping component with the same planning methods. We continuously update the prior map knowledge in our approach. And we can see that having this informative map priors pushes most of the informative planners in active learning performance, so more toward the top left, such that now all planners reliably outperform the coverage baseline. And reliably, the global planners, the green, blue, and orange, now outperform the image-based local planner in purple, which provides more solid evidence for the benefit of having this continuously updated global map knowledge. And next, we studied different methods of calculating the active learning acquisition objective or the informative path planning utility function. So just to recap, in the framework, the objective is to collect the images with the highest model uncertainty, reasoning that these represent the highest information value when added to the training set. So in deep learning, there are different methods of estimating this model uncertainty, and our goal was to investigate them in a robotic planning context. So first, we explore the deterministic non-Bayesian objective, where we develop the uncertainty simply based on the prediction entropy over the labels in semantic segmentation. And we also explore two different Bayesian uncertainty measures using an ensemble of networks in yellow and Monte Carlo dropout in blue. So as we can see in the plots, the Bayesian uncertainty measures reliably outperform the non-Bayesian deterministic objective, which supports what we know from literature, that deterministic uncertainty tends to be generally poorly globally calibrated with respect to the Bayesian approaches. We can also validate this qualitatively by looking at error uncertainty using different approaches. So from left to right, we can see the input RGB image to the network, the ground truth labels obtained from the data set, the network prediction, an error map where whiter indicates higher error, and uncertainty where lighter indicates higher uncertainty, computed either the deterministic non-Bayesian approach on the top and the Bayesian ensemble on the bottom. So if we look at how error and uncertainty correlate using the different methods, we can see that the prediction error correlates only weakly with the model uncertainty using the deterministic approach, which explains why active learning performance is worse in the graphs we saw on the previous slide. And the key insight behind this experiment is to transfer these findings from computer vision to robotics context and pave the way for future work in this area. Now, so far, we discussed active planning only on this ISPRS Potsdam dataset. But you might ask, does these results also hold true from different environments? So we tested the framework on another dataset called RIT18. So in contrast to the Potsdam dataset, this is from an entirely different domain of land cover with more connected regions, such as the grassy area and the pavement. And the graph shows the active learning performance for the same planning strategies. And we notice very similar trends as for Potsdam. Interestingly, the global map-based planners perform even better than the local planner because then they can cover the connected regions more quickly, as opposed to this incremental local movements we obtain using the local image-based planner. So from this, we can deduce something about generalizability of the active planning framework, and also that the structure and the environment plays a big role in terms of how these planners perform relative to each other. And finally, moving towards a more real-world deployment scenario, we tested the approach in Flightmare, a realistic simulation environment which emulates the UAV physics and the deployment condition in an industrial environment provided by the simulator. Again, on the figure, we can see the planning results using the different planning strategies. And again, we see the global map-based planners outperforming local planning here, which further supports generalizability. So this approach essentially shows how we can integrate together different elements of the informative path planning framework, planning, mapping, and active learning to show how we can use it for continuous model improvement in unseen environments. So with that, I would like to move on to the third aspect of learning for informative path planning I will present today, which is neural representations for active sensing. So again, we consider the informative path planning problem of actively collecting useful data, but we're going to consider a slightly different problem setup. So we have a 3D object of interest that we would like to reconstruct, for example, this Bata statue, and the robotic RGB camera setup. The camera can move about the object to take images at certain locations. So here the pyramids represent possible camera viewpoints. And here our goal is to iteratively select the next best views to maximize our understanding about the object of interest. So we want to collect informative images as quickly as possible. And some of us may know this is closely related to the informative path planning problem and is called the next best view planning problem. So how do we do that? A common strategy is to use a map representation of the object. For example, a surface, a mesh, or a volume, as we see in these examples, and then plan the next best views based on the current map state, reflecting all the measurements collected so far. However, for larger environments, maintaining such large maps is compute and memory intensive, especially if we want to store very detailed information about the object. So to address these issues, we're going to talk about an approach for next best view planning using image-based neural rendering. Now, without going into too many details about the computer vision part, the key idea is that image-based neural rendering is a representation that conditions the implicit representation on image inputs after training on different scenes. And this allows the network to generalize to new environments and perform novel view synthesis from a sparse set of views. So how do we use this concept of image-based rendering in the next best view planning context? So first, we sample potential viewpoints around the objects, so this camera pyramids. And then for each of these candidates, we use image-based neural rendering network, and we render RGB and uncertainty. As in the active learning problem, uncertainty tells us something about information value, because when uncertainty is high, it means that we want to collect more images there to increase our understanding about the object and reduce uncertainty. Based on this reasoning, the planning strategy selects the most uncertain candidate as the next goal. The camera then moves to take an image there. We store all the images collected during a mission and use them to condition our network as reference images for future iterations of the next best view planning loop. So we repeat this process a number of times until a measurement budget, for example, a fixed number of images, has been exceeded. In this way, using this framework, we can plan without relying on an explicit map representation or periodically retraining the network. This can be done purely online using simply the network to capture everything we know. So here are some results on the well-known DTU dataset. So we evaluate the benefit of using uncertainty to guide the selection of reference images for next best view rendering. Now, DTU is a dataset which has pre-recorded camera poses about an object, and we assess different strategies for collecting reference images among candidates. So we compared in the red, the next best view planning strategy based on image-based rendering and uncertainty, a random motion about the object, and maximum view distance, which is a coverage-like strategy which selects the next image according to maximum distance from the current position. Looking at the plots, we can see that using uncertainty consistently leads to improvements in the image quality rendering metrics for unselected test views in the dataset. Now, we performed a similar experiment using a more realistic robotic simulator based on ShapeNet models. The main difference with respect to the DTU dataset is that here we have a continuous action space around the object, which allows for more flexibility when picking new viewpoints and also a more interesting and challenging problem for planning. Here we see even more pronounced differences between the image rendering-based strategy using uncertainty and the baselines in terms of image quality. So I would like to share what it actually looks like. So there we see the different planning strategies, and the pyramids represent the results of a planning mission, so where the planning strategy chose to collect images. And interestingly, we can see that the uncertainty way, focusing on areas with high structural detail where the object is more complex. For example, we can see more in front of the car bonnet. And if we use collected images, then for offline scene reconstruction, we can also see visually it's much better when we have collected actively more images of the challenging part of the scene. Offline scene an intelligent planning approach. So that was it on our 3 topics for today. But before ending the presentation, I want to share a few ideas and thoughts about future works that we can discuss. First, all of the work I presented considered obstacle-free environments, which guarantees and simplifies safe exploration. So the natural next step, we think, would be to extend these ideas to cluttered environments, such as facilities or forests, and situations where the robot needs to both actively explore as well as avoid obstacles. So an open question here is, how can we use models to complement learning in this scenario, as well as using uncertainty to avoid risky actions? We can also consider environment complexity from a different point of view. For example, how can we incorporate dynamic objects into our planning problems, or add a temporal element into our monitoring scenario? Second, we discussed using learning for data gathering and how to improve robotic perception in this active learning. But taking this one step further, if we think about in the direction of self-supervised learning, we could ask ourselves, how can we develop continual learning methods where we deploy a robot and allow it to adapt to completely new environments, retraining the network during a mission, improving a network during a mission in these environments in the wild, which is a very exciting prospect. Third, we think there's a lot of work to be done in using semantics to improve learning-based active sensing and informative path planning. So, for example, in the image-based rendering problem, we could incorporate semantic predictions to allow the robot to focus on targeted areas which carry semantic meaning. So this poses many interesting questions. How can we extract semantics with the uncertainty? Can we sample candidates in an intelligent way, knowing that some parts of the environment are more interesting than others, to balance exploration and exploitation, and so on? Finally, a major bottleneck in the work presented was how time and compute consuming these learning-based methods are to train. And therefore, to fully exploit robot learning in the planning context, we should also investigate strategy for efficient retraining and online adaptation. So slowly, this brings us to the end of the presentation. So I want to wrap up with a summary of what we have discussed today. So we talked about the problem of active sensing and the value of using informative path planning in these problems to allow robots to actively and efficiently collect new data in data gathering missions. Then, building the structure of the informative path planning framework, we discussed the role of recently emerging learning-based methods, including reinforcement learning, active learning, and neural representations, and how they can accelerate as well as complement model-based methods in these scenarios. So that brings us to the end. Thank you for your attention. And now I'm happy to have the discussion and take on any questions.
Okay, thank you for the great talk. There's one question first from the YouTube side. I'll just read the question for you, Marija. There's a question on the YouTube live stream saying, I was wondering if there are any assumptions on the underlying function the robot is attempting to estimate. If yes, could you explain a bit more on what they are?
So yes, we do place some assumptions. For example, in this case of semantic segmentation, where we use the occupancy grid as the underlying map representation, we place an assumption that the adjacent cells in the map are not correlated, for instance.
Okay. Yeah. Are there any questions from the Zoom people? Oh, there's one person. Let's see, who's that? Hello, Harsh. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Yes. Thank you so much. Hi, Marija. Great talk. Thank you so much for it. I was just wondering, in regards to the multi-agent system that you're using, is there any way that you can guarantee safety so that there's no clashes between two agents?
So in this case, we, in the reinforcement learning approach, we actively mask out the actions that lead to a collision in order to simplify the problem. And also, I think it's not super challenging in this scenario because we don't have any obstacles in the environment. And essentially, by the design of the action space, we avoid invalid actions such as colliding into other agents or going outside the environment bounds. But obviously, if there is any uncertainty in the localization, for example, we would need to take more sophisticated measures to make sure that collision-free operation is in place. Thanks for the interesting question.
Okay. Oh, there's another question from David.
Hi. So in a lot of these approaches, it looks like there's kind of like a 2 to 3 times improvement, maybe. Like, are there any domains where you think there might be like a 10 or 100 times improvement? And like, if so, what are the barriers to kind of working in those domains? Like beyond a coverage baseline?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And also, we're interested in also working with people who from the application side have need for these algorithms. So from our experience, the benefit becomes higher when there is a highly uneven distribution of features or areas of interest in the environment, which would warrant this use of informative path planning to actively collect data. So one could think that, so if we have the same extent of the environment and things are more or less uniformly distributed, for example, the value wouldn't be high because an exploration strategy would be just as efficient of using an informative path planning strategy. So if things are very uneven or there are clusters that make sense to inspect, and we have a sensor which is very sensitive to, for example, altitude, and one really has to find these areas of interest, then reduce altitude, take more measurements there, that would increase the benefit of using informative path planning. So that is one situation. And the other one, I think, would be where we have very large environments where a coverage-based strategy would simply take too long. So then we could use informative path planning to avoid spending more time in areas that are not interesting. I hope that makes sense.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
There's another question from YouTube. I'll just type on the chat. Yeah, I just copied it, paste on the chat.
How do you, I'll just read the question so that people can also hear it. How do you convert the information extracted from RL-based techniques to the state space or configuration space for path planning? Awesome lecture, by the way. Where can I read your work in detail? So thanks. Maybe the easiest thing is to email so that I can send you links. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to go from here to YouTube now. And to answer your question, the information value is really reflected on the map because we still do use a map to estimate the information value. So we take a measurement and we see what the difference, what effect it has on the map. So that is how, depending on which action you take, that is the direction in which your map will evolve, and from that you can extract the information value. Then you can nudge learning or nudge your actions in the direction. So, okay, when I do this, my map changes in this way and I get more information value.
Okay,
So I
thank
think
you.
that is really the key link, and that is also why in the informative path planning framework I try to connect the sensor to the map and how it is provides the information necessary for the utility function.
Yep. There's another question on the Zoom from Jae Young.
Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for the great presentation. I was just wondering if you can share some insights on sort of if you have any particular sort of landscapes of the information space that make this kind of approach particularly more useful than other problems, if the sort of utility needs to be more dense, or it's more effective on sort of these more sparse reward problems, or how this relates to also your approach on using RL relates to this kind of is it more related to how the information function looks like, that we should choose which method to use, or do you think RL is a bit kind of applicable for, in general, most informative path planning problems that can maximize information gathering?
I think that's a really good question, and also related to what David asked. I think that we actually have a valuable use for informative path planning when we have these uneven distributions from the information landscape point of view. So in the thermal mapping example I showed, it was very non-homogeneous. So one side of the field was hotter than others, for example, and that's like a typical use case because you can intuitively understand that, okay, on one side, that's where the information is. So it makes sense to collect more measurements there. And I think what justifies the use of this more complex decision-making approaches, such as RL, is really having this complex prediction for future actions, in the sense that in this case, the sensor model is altitude dependent, so you cannot easily judge what it would be the benefit of having some measurements at intermediate altitude, some measurements at a lower altitude, and some at a higher altitude. So it's a very complex optimization problem to solve from that point of view, because you have to take into account that you have a complicated trade-off between the information gain and coverage, for example, in the UAV-based terrain monitoring. So when you have some optimization problem that is non-trivial to solve, then I think this learning-based methods make sense. And I think informative path planning makes sense in situations where information value on the landscape and in the environment is not evenly distributed. So we have like clusters or gradients where we need to take more measurements. Thanks for the question.
There's another question from Dave. Yeah.
I was just curious if you had any thoughts on like what techniques are applicable for really long horizon planning. Like, is learning one, or does it break down, or are there other like classes of techniques that you think might work there?
That's a good question. I think that usually we try to set like a reasonable planning horizon of a view waypoints, because you also have to have actually collected some information until you make the next decision. Otherwise, it would converge an offline path planning problem where the horizon is just the entire mission. So you have to have some kind of reasonable horizon anyways, so that you can update your map. But I guess it also depends on how reliable your predictor is. because if you can predict reliably the future measurements, then you can have a longer planning horizon and not go wrong too many times. So I think there's a couple of different things at play there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I have my own question, by the way. Yeah, I have a question on the deep reinforcement learning project component of your talk. Like, I think you mentioned that like each UAV measures the local area and updates the local maps and feed that maps into the actor network. And then there's another centralized creating network that uses a global map. And my question is, how realistic is the assumption then there is a global map on the environment? Like, for example, if the environment is unknown previously, then like which entity has the access to the global map? Is this question valid?
Yeah, I think it is valid. So I think it depends on the simulator that you use, because obviously we train these approaches in a simulator where you have access to the ground truth information. And therefore you can actually develop this global map, which has information from all the agents, which you wouldn't have in the real world. So for the training phase, I think it's valid. But then related to your question, I think another research direction that I would like to point out is that bridging the sim to real gap is really important for these approaches, because your simulator has to be very reliable to train reliably using the centralized grid. Otherwise, your assumptions kind of for training don't hold.
Okay. Oh, got it. Yeah,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think there's another question from the YouTube. I will just copy that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just write my email there for the YouTube. So the question is, how does the framework manage obstacles, or in the case of multi-agent planning, the presence of other robots? Do the robots communicate with each other, and is there any replanning involved? So in this case, for example, in the multi-agent planning, the robots communicate with each other within a specific radius. So there is like a distance at which you know what the other agent is seeing. And there are some assumptions there on the fact that there is no localization uncertainty, so you know where the robots are. And by the structure of the reinforcement learning problem, we do not allow actions that lead to collision with the other agents, because you know what they are. So you effectively learn to not collide, because you get during the training phase this action is simply invalid. And for managing obstacles, actually I did not present any work where there's obstacles in the environment and you actively have to avoid them. But this is something that we're actually currently investigating, and I think a lot of future work will go in that direction too, because then also for thinking about sensing in 3D environments, for example, you have issues of partial observability, needing to both explore and avoid obstacles and so on. So I think that's a very exciting research direction for learning-based methods.
Yep, thank you so much. Does anyone have more questions on the Zoom side? I have like one quick question. I think you briefly mentioned about like that there's a limitations on the compute power on the actual robot deployments, and we had to come up with a model that is less computationally heavy. And for example, in the case of image-based rendering, that's like a huge like amount of compute is required. Do you have any rough ideas or like a rough plan for the future work that how you could handle these issues, like in order to reduce the amount of computation needed for the robot deployment?
So I guess one common theme is like using this networks to contain information so that you don't need to essentially learn something about the environment. So one neat thing about this image-based neural rendering is that the network actually contains everything that you need to know about the scene. So you can render new views and you don't need to maintain this huge voxel map about the environment. But then that kind of moves in tandem with computer vision. So to what extent our networks can generalize and so on. And that will enable operation in larger environments.
Okay.
So making really efficient use of deep learning to circumvent some of these issues and avoid storing things that are unnecessary. I guess you also see that in the reinforcement learning projects.
Okay. Yep. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? If not, then we'll finish the talk here today. And yeah, thank you again. I greatly appreciate Dr. Marija Popović to join this talk. It was a great talk, and thank you everyone for joining this talk today. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Yep, me too. Yeah, thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.